It's my pleasure on behalf of my Milken Institute colleagues around the world to welcome you to our inaugural MENA Summit. Many of you have been with us for the last couple of days as you traverse our usual trajectory through medical research, philanthropy, capital markets, etc. And what I would encourage you to do as you engage with the program is to go to things that don't pertain to your day job and try to see the interconnectedness of things. We at the Institute have 8 distinct centers, and the reason for that is we try to understand in all their complexities the problems that the world is facing. So while all of the advances in medical research, which have yielded a longevity dividend and people are living longer and longer, healthy lives around the world, at the same time, existing pension schemes around the world have been struggling with 0 or negative interest rate returns for some time, and now have a population that they're going to need to sustain even longer than initially anticipated because of that longevity dividend. So while those two things might not seem connected at first glance, when you start to peel the onion and understand how they are very connected, you try and devise solutions that are more meaningful and lasting, which is something that we try to do at the Institute. So we prepared a short video to explain a little bit about our work for those of you who are engaging with us for the first time. So let's look at it right now.
What is a meaningful life to me and others? My guess is each person might have a different definition.
Having a sense of purpose, having a sense of personal satisfaction in what you're doing.
Hope and longevity and health.
For many people, a meaningful life is being able to provide food and shelter for your family, education, safety.
How can there be so many poor people at the same time there's so much abundance? And how could so many people be starving to death and so many others struggling with obesity? It's really about mismatched resources.
A meaningful life is one of the reasons I'm actually at the Institute. I want my actions and the actions of the people I work with to make a difference.
Our work is very much about the interconnectedness of things. You can't talk about jobs and having meaningful work if you're unhealthy and can't pay your bills if you're fighting cancer.
One of the amazing strengths at the Milken Institute is the ability to bring people together from all of the diverse sectors.
The chance to mix and mingle with people from the business community, from the science community, from politics and government, to try to figure out how we can move the needle in the right direction.
Folks actually come to us and say, we're seeing issues around addressing malnutrition or clean energy in Africa, but we are seeing a funding gap. Can you help us figure it out?
We're not shy to say that capital is required to solve many of these things. The best ideas on the planet, unfunded, go nowhere.
Philanthropy is going to continue to be a bigger part of the conversation. Climate change to education to pandemic, flu. Philanthropy can take on a tremendous amount of risk.
I operate in a country where the kids are not in school. Women are not getting educated. It's dumb for me not to feel that I must do something about that.
Our goal is to not just try to be providing ideas that are new, but rather taking ideas to achieve results in the real world.
The 21st Century Cures Act was recently signed into law, very exciting to be a part of. It was a powerful statement of what can happen when there's a coming together around a common enemy, and the enemy in this case is disease.
There's dramatic changes in all industries. It's not just media, and it's not just healthcare, and it's not just manufacturing, but this is our challenge, the potential disintermediation of industries.
It won't be one company, institution, organization, but it'll be the collaborative that actually brings the solutions that we need.
We have been a good and strong partner to those that are in the field affecting change around the world.
We want to solve these problems so that the next generation that comes along is also feeling like they will have a meaningful life.
Thank you. So with that, I want to turn to our conversation with Tom Barrack. Tom is the executive chairman of Colony Northstar. Colony Northstar is one of the largest diversified real estate and investment management leaders in the world. He served in the Reagan administration as Deputy Undersecretary of the Department of the Interior and currently serves as a trusted advisor to the administration and White House. He will be joined in conversation by Staci Warden, Executive Director of the Center for Financial Markets at the Institute. So Tom, Staci, please.
Can I cue the Fortune magazine? I'd like to start off by just embarrassing you. So can we cue the Fortune magazine?
Oh my God.
So Tom Barrack, your grandfather came to the United States on a boat. Your father was a grocer. You organized the presidential inaugural. Before we start, and we'll do a world tour with both your policy hat on and your investor hat on. But start by telling us kind of your story, and I don't mean a blow by blow, but the highlights and the kind of the methodology and the philosophy behind it. I mean, I think it was a combination maybe of grit, determination, some luck, ability to play squash. You know, people say that they're going to face the tiger, or they say they're going to ride the tiger, but Tom, you have a different philosophy, don't you?
Well, look, I think that whatever tiny modicum of success I've achieved is a result of two primary things, all of which relates to luck, which is having the DNA of a wonderful immigrant Lebanese family and the scent of thousands of years of civilization and culture that came from that Lebanese background, that was melded by the freedom and the gift of being able to do whatever you can dream in America. So it's just a typical immigrant story. And I think along that road, like all of us, that adaptability and the ability to push through comfort barriers, to calibrate risk, is what allows you to go to the edge. Sometimes you fall off the edge, but every time you fall off the edge, you pick yourself up a little bit quicker, a little bit better, and the fear of going to that edge evaporates. But I think it's tiny things. You know, I tell my sons, two of whom are here today, that 90% of success is showing up. You do it now. You do it right, you do what you say, you show up when you don't want to show up. And over time, karma works. It just doesn't necessarily work at the moment that we need it, but it does work.
But when you say things like become the tiger, what is that karma? Is that what you mean by karma, or?
Well, when I say become the tiger, one thing is for sure. Every morning in the jungle, a lion wakes up and says, all I have to do is run faster than the slowest antelope. And an antelope wakes up and says, all I have to do is run faster than the fastest lion. But whether you're a lion or an antelope, you better wake up and get running. So it's a matter of leadership for all of us, which is taking on that cadence of courage when you don't have all the facts or information. We live in an era right now that's very different. I mean, in this region, we had trading patterns for hundreds of years. And all along the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Gulf, trade was based on somebody having a little bit of knowledge that somebody else didn't. And that arbitrage of knowledge was the value. Today, we don't really have that. Knowledge is available instantaneously to all of us, and it's available on a handheld. So there has to be something else. What's the edge? What gives you the ability to compete? What gives you the ability to create a yield that's greater than some competitive yield? That value-added piece is an orchestration of attributes other than information. So that's a learned trade, and that trade, and when I say being a tiger, is an offense. And today, in the environment, people are talking about the volatility in the market and interest rates rising and full employment in the United States and a global impasse and a President of the United States who may be confusing to the international marketplace because he's speaking a vocabulary and a cadence that we haven't heard before. And you can be paralyzed. Or you can say, every day I'm going to get up and I'm going to leave everything better a little more than the day that I found it before. And that's the only message of being a tiger.
Okay, I do want to get to sort of the global policy and the Trump administration, but tell us a little bit about colony capital and how do you kind of execute on that, doing a little better every day when you think about asset allocation, when you think about, when you get up in the morning and you're running a global real estate company and you're trying to build that company, how do you kind of, what's your investment philosophy?
I call him Mike Milken. I say, Mike, give me the 3 things today that we should be doing. No, it's running a public company is a slow-moving train. And I think what we've all learned is you have to take short-term pain for long-term gain. And that's sometimes very complicated, especially with hard assets, to have predictable quarterly earnings. But the market has a voracious appetite for yield. So at a time where the market is looking for yield, intuitively and instinctively, I say we should be looking at total return. Mm-hmm. Forget about yield and go to total return. Because most of yield today in most asset classes is return of capital. So the risk-adjusted returns on what's really happening because of unbelievably low interest rates and tightening cap rates across the realm are creating an artificial confidence in the long-term ability for these assets to grow under inflationary pressure. So Colony is very simple. It has 4 or 5 silos of different assets. It grows those assets over time with a value-added strategy. And it has a big private equity arm that focuses on digital infrastructure and leverage buyouts in the $1 billion to $15 billion range. But I think we all compete in a marketplace that's flooded with liquidity, where everybody has the same or equivalent ideas, and it's based on long-term relationships and harvesting those relationships slowly and with integrity over time is the competitive edge.
And you have done that over the course of decades, and you are truly a man of the world, and you are a consigliere to the President of the United States. You've known him for a long time. You're called the Trump Whisperer. You're offered a number of cabinet positions. I'm going to hold you accountable for everything he does now. You've offered a number of cabinet positions, the ambassadorship to Mexico, and you talk to him with regularity. So, what do you guys talk about?
Let me back up a little bit, and then I'll tell you what we talk about. I think especially to an international audience, what's interesting is who is the man? Because what we're all experiencing is being the recipient of a different vocabulary and a different cadence of diplomacy coming out of America than we've ever experienced before. So the art of the dialect, the political astuteness of words that are chosen, the manner or abruptness of how he appears to conduct the presidency is startling. And forgetting about the political views, because I'm not really political, and I wasn't with him because I had a political view. He's been a friend for 40 years. We've been in business a myriad of times. And I really admired his courage, being a non-political entrant into this arena. We have one of the best. President Bush is here, who has a very distinct set of talents and attributes and who did a great job at governing and knew how to govern. But you had a candidate here who had never governed. He had been successful in finance and he had been a reality talk show host, but decided that he could find this crack in America, this broad-based dissatisfaction with the status quo, and capitalize on it and shake the barnacles off a system that needed to be startled a bit. And that's who he is. So I can tell you that he's better than his billing. So the abruptness of what appears to be sometimes inarticulate language or infuriating rhetoric to various groups is a practice which he utilized over long periods of time of managing by conflict, managing different points of view by chaos. A simple example, previous presidents may have wanted to analyze who had the best espresso, and they would analyze the bean, where it was grown, how it was seeded, how it was fertilized, how it was harvested, where it was roasted, how it was shipped, how it was ground once it got to the espresso machine, what kind of espresso machine, what kind of water. This president sits and takes 10 of you who he knows are the greatest coffee connoisseurs, sits you around the table, gives you a coffee and watches the expression. And based on his ability, his instinctive ability in understanding who you are, then makes a determination as to which one is the best expert at that particular coffee, and then pits one against the other. And out of that dialogue, he'll then come up with a conclusion.
Okay, but in the process, he can say some pretty outrageous things about coffee. And if you're a policymaker from another country, or you're a business person from another country, do you just ignore it? Are you counseling us to ignore that, or to what extent do you take that seriously, or how do you navigate, as a foreign person, how do you sort of navigate the rhetoric and the seeming tenor of the administration, and him in particular?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult because it's unsettling, right? So, and I'm not up here, I could give you the litany of achievements which he and his administration have accomplished in the last 14 months, and it sounds like a paid political advertisement. So I'm not going to do that. What it is, though, is this ability to put everybody off balance allows him the opportunity to end run his own system. So in foreign diplomacy, let me give you an example. At the beginning of his administration, he started with an Islamic ban. And I can tell you he's not a racist. He had no preconceived notion of what Islam was. I was probably the only Arab he knew. He thought Lebanese was a sexual preference. He didn't understand it. And at the time, I said, Mr. President, with all due respect, are you out of your mind? He said, no, I have a method to my madness. I said, look, you're taking 1.8 billion people and putting them in a box. He said, no, but I don't intend to leave it there. So fast forward, we were all in shock, and what happens is you have a little judge from Hawaii who says, by the way, you may be President of the United States, and I'm not going to allow you to impugn the integrity of the system this way. And we have a halt. So from that point of view, where everybody thought he was totally racist against our region, fast forward to May, in which, with his initiative and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law's initiative, and the help of Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman, convenes the first American Arab Islamic Summit in Riyadh, with 53 countries joining, in which unanimously there's a chorus for the return to benevolent Islam, to the beauty of what Islam should be, and a resounding defiance of what we knew as radical Islam. So this president, coming from an Islamic ban, probably did more in bridging that first part of reuniting West with East, which is a necessity, right? When you look at the selfish aspect for the West, if we have 80 million youngsters from Egypt to Iran who have no hope, who have no education, who have no jobs, who have an economy that is not working for them, and who have a hostile West that don't understand the religion, this is not going to be good for the West.
Is he popular in the region?
He's popular in that the American people that elected him. So if you take what he calls his core, by the way, part of what's happening is he's learning the art of consensus and how to govern. So his core, which was his voting base, was kind of the center of America. It was the typical white, uneducated male who was his voting base, who had just been fed up with political rhetoric.
Yeah.
So is he popular? On both coasts, when I go home, I take nothing but abuse for being his friend. Right? So on both coasts, kind of the higher educated people, the Democrats that most of us know, feel that words do matter. The presidential etiquette and style dictates hope and aspirations for all the communities in the world, and that he's the president of the world, not just to his core. And that's annoying. On the other hand, there's a large group of people who say, separate the rhetoric from the actions. Let's look at the actions. Let's look at what's happening in the Middle East. Let's look at what's happening in Asia. Let's look at what's happening in Latin America. Let's look at what's happening in the economy. And now you're at close to full employment. You have about 4% growth. You have the markets being concerned about what they wanted in the first place. So I think he feels that he's doing the job by challenging the system, that his job is not to be at the beginning point of his career in politics. He didn't view himself as being the cheerleader and chief. He's moving now to taking this position on a global basis of saying, I have to broaden my base. It's going to happen. Okay. I think it'll happen slowly.
So let me stay with the Middle East for a moment. You have described U.S. policy to the Middle East as embrace and abandon. Can you just describe what you mean by that? And do you think that there's a shift now that could happen with this administration potentially, or is happening, or an elevation of our game in the region?
Sure, and I feel, as a student sitting with so many professors in the audience, it's just my personal point of view, is that the Middle East is a geographic nomenclature. As we know, the region is consisted of tribes and flags who disagree on everything, and have disagreed on everything historically. Disagreed on religion, disagreed on geography, disagreed on economics, disagreed on dress. And from the beginning of modern time, the hand of the West has utilized most of the region for their own purposes. So the oil curse, which was a tremendous benefit to the region and also created a tremendous detriment, was organized by the West for its own purposes. And every time the West became uncomfortable with it, it would just change the regime. And it would blame the previous regime for whatever the problem was that it wanted. But chaos and controversy and conflict were a good thing, because there could be no alignment of interests that could then be counter to the West's interests. Fast forward, we have new eras of leadership. This is a great example of what's done in the second and third generation of this unbelievably prophetic Bedouin wisdom, and what can happen in embracing all elements of people in a very difficult neighborhood. But the West was really mostly concerned with just extracting from this region fossil fuels, and was not really concerned with what the development of the cultures or the civilizations were. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Sunni-Shia conflict, the skirmishes that are all at the sides, the Turks deciding that they wanted to be a caliphate once again, Egypt with a burgeoning population and 60% of it being under the age of 16, Saudi Arabia growing into a new kind of economy that had to readjust itself and do it boldly, deciding whether it needed to be a kingdom or something else. All those stars aligned at the time that you got a president who said, I need to end run my own diplomacy system. of this cadence of just being predictable for America with its relationship with the Middle East, because everything is changing. And he did. Now, we're not sure of what the ramifications of all this are yet because it's in process. So for the first time, he came to this region and asked the right questions from the right leaders. So all of a sudden you had this alignment between the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United States, and Egypt. We had some fallout of other Gulf relationships that hopefully will fall back in line. And then the boldness of a move of saying, okay, now that we have the Sunnis aligned with Israel, we're going to move our embassy to Jerusalem and push a Palestinian-Israeli solution. Now, the harshness of that is annoying to the region. I think you'll see a olive branch out to the Palestinians looking for a solution. And as we know, there's so many unintended consequences all around us of all of the other countries, but the U.S. is starting to play a different kind of a role. Rather than profiteering from the fossil fuel era of what's there, saying we better pay attention, figure out a way to embrace all of the good aspects of Islam, to supply hope and an aspirational diagram for the youth in the area, and take leadership in trying to solve these problems with young leadership in all these countries who are trying to realign their own countries, change the economy from fossil fuel based, educate their own people, and realign in a geographic structure in a very, very difficult neighborhood. So I think it's a great step forward quickly. What's annoying to all of us is the diplomatic cadence, which is the communication between all of these differing countries is upset at the moment.
It's also sometimes frightening, right? Some of the things with North Korea, for example. And
But let's take North Korea. I mean, we all sat and said, has this president lost his mind? He's talking about who has the biggest red button. Right? And we all sat there and said, oh no, it's over.
the Nikkei had its best year ever, too, right?
Right? But what happens is the next week, North Korea goes to South Korea and says, by the way, let's align and go to the Olympics together. So what this does is embolden the president to say, if I take these extreme positions, which other countries are not used to, it forces them to the bargaining table sooner, quicker, and I end-run this endless diplomacy syndrome, because what he knows is, for instance, Iran has a 30-year plan. So is Iran concerned with the president moving in months or years? Not really. So they'll outwait the diplomatic process. So in essence, by startling these systems, with President Xi, just a cute story. So President Trump invites President Xi from China to visit the US. And he invites him to Mar-a-Lago. So you can imagine President Xi, they have to be the two most powerful people in the world, saying, I thought I was going to the White House, I'm going to a country club. So he shows up at the country club, and if you remember, this day was the day that the US fired 57 ballistic missiles into the garage doors in Syria from the destroyers that were 250 kilometers offshore. So they're sitting at a table, it's 80 degrees, President Xi is cutting his steak, and H.R. McMaster's, the head of the National Security Council, who's a general, steps behind the president and says, Mr. President, we're locked and loaded. President Xi hears those words, he has a translator on the other side, and he says, well, what did he say? He says, I'm sorry, Mr. President, I couldn't hear. So President Trump says, I want to talk to the captain of the first destroyer. They call the captain of the first destroyer as President Xi is sitting here. And of course, the captain of the destroyer is 18 years old. You know, these kids that now are on the destroyers, they're video games. So he's talking to the captain, he says, I want to know, what are the unintended consequences of what damage could be done? He said, sir, I promise you there'll be no unintended fatalities. So he turns around, he puts the phone down. Now President Xi has gone to the chocolate cake. President Trump is still talking on the phone. So he tells H.R. McMaster, he says, we're locked and loaded, let it go. So all of a sudden, President Trump says, I better tell President Xi what's going on because in 27 minutes, these ballistic missiles are going to fly in the front door. So he leans over to President Xi and he says, President Xi, I think I should tell you something. And now, 26 minutes, there's going to be 57 ballistic missiles that are going to go in the front door in Syria. And President Xi is just putting the chocolate cake in and starts choking and goes to his translator and says, repeat. So at that moment, a bond, it's never happened before in the free world, right? Of the two most powerful countries who have a kind of amity and animosity of the two men sitting there and that dialogue sharing created a bond. So you can have the harshness of America talking about sanctions against China, but you have two men that have a relationship. The same thing happened in Mexico, the same thing in Canada, the same thing in Australia. So as wild as it is for the rest of us to watch this unorchestrated foreign policy, underneath it, if you evaluate what's actually happening, so far it's been pretty good. It's in process, but it's been pretty good.
Okay, so let's talk about Latin America. You're a big proponent of the region. You're a huge advocate for the importance of the region. You know, when I look at it now, I see a lot of strategic, things that can make me nervous strategically. We have perhaps Lopez Obrador. He's going for his third try for the president. He's got a plurality of the votes in the early polling. In Venezuela, we have chaos, and Russia has just agreed to restructure $3 billion worth of its sovereign debt, and you can imagine sort of the machinations going on there. And then we've got a U.S. president kind of, I would say, at his most nationalistic when it comes to the region in Mexico. And you have a great line, which is, make the Americas great again. And how do you see this sort of strategic way forward there, and what do you tell him when you talk about that?
What I tell him is Mr. President, I think your stance on Mexico is too harsh, and I'll explain to you why. And he says, Tom, thanks very much for sharing that with me, but if I listened to you, I'd still be on The Apprentice. I wouldn't be the president. I said, yes, sir, that's true. But we share 2,000 miles of border with Mexico. Our trade, the U.S. trade with Mexico is $1.2 billion a day. $1.2 billion a day. With Canada, it's the same thing. If you took all of North America on a trade basis, it's 4 times what our trade is with China and 1/15 the deficit. So China, who is the competitor for the U.S. no matter how you look at it over time, has a 30-year plan, and they have one belt, one road, and they're connecting the Spice Road all over again to Europe and Africa. If we took a different approach to the Americas, you would evaporate the threat of Obrador. And I tell the president, I said, we're going to need a wall. If we keep having this rhetoric, you're going to need a wall because you're going to have the communists that are going to be right at the border. And the Mexicans are a proud people, so culturally antagonizing them over time is not a great thing. So Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Venezuela, Brazil are have some of the same endemic characteristics as this region. We call it Latin America, but each country is its own flag and its own tribe, and there's no united trading bloc of any of them. And quite honestly, for the last 8 years, we haven't paid attention to them. Caribbean, the same thing. So you look at what's happened to Puerto Rico, for instance, which is part of our colonies. So Secretary Tillerson, who is so capable and competent, did a great job in the last 2 weeks of going to Latin America, and what they need is a kiss and a hug, not a wall. So the wall, in essence, could be and should be greater infrastructure. The real problem with Mexico is there's not enough passporting for trade in goods and people in a modern way to go back and forth across those borders. And the wall should actually be on the other side because the drugs are coming in from Central
At the bottom of Mexico, the wall.
Exactly. So all of these things he understands and agrees with. His negotiating style in the middle of NAFTA is, again, to push 100 meters beyond what that edge would be, knowing and thinking that by that startling action, he'll be able to negotiate something quicker and better for both sides by taking what seems to be a more absurd position. I think that's what you'll see with NAFTA. You have great people. You have Bob Lighthouser and Wilbur Ross and Steve Mnuchin, Gary Cohn, all working at this process. But if you took the position that you're going to start with the Americas, it's not protectionist, because everything that gets better then for the world. Gets more efficient for Europe, gets more efficient for the Middle East, is a competitive pressure on Asia, which will make Asia be more productive itself. But these are all long-term goals, and he doesn't even have a team in place yet.
Right. But I think that's a good pivot to move back towards kind of an investor, putting your investor hat back on and a global asset allocation hat. And when you think about sort of the global opportunities, imagine you have a large, very important institutional investor come to you for global asset allocation advice, and just to help them think through where the opportunities are. What would you tell her?
Well, look, I think the question is, do you have an endowment mentality or do you have a pension fund mentality? Are we managing liabilities or are we managing assets? And the Rubik's Cube of understanding currency fluctuation and transparency of legal systems and growth cycles is unbelievably complicated if you're a trader in liquid assets. So it seems to me at a time where you have growth all over the world, that there's a balance between developed and emerging markets. And that's the first place within all of the structures of what those asset classes are. But I see the most consistent returns over the longest period of time. Forget about bonds, because you're all in bonds. You need to be in bonds. Nobody can explain to me why you're in bonds, but you're always going to be in bonds. Is really take a balance between hard assets that have replicatable and growing income streams on a reasonably levered basis, which over time will be the beneficiary of an inflationary cycle.
Okay, but where? I want countries and sectors.
Well, I think you start in the most transparent, liquid, tax-efficient regime. So for us, that happens to be the United States. And the United States is a buoyant market in which supply and demand is not out of balance. So no matter what's happened with the flow of capital into America, supply and demand of real estate itself has been in parity. And on a risk-adjusted basis, it's been a very strong asset class. But it doesn't have the total return characteristics that you get out of private equity. So behind that, the emerging markets right now, as the dollar weakens and as interest rate perceptions go up, is an interesting place to be. Less liquidity, more currency risk, and a less transparent legal system. So that risk profile has to produce higher returns. I think private equity in every decade, especially now, is the most interesting asset class to me. It has the most complications. It's the hardest entry point. It has the most liquidity in the market. When you can buy a company in a developed country at an 8 times multiple and get long-term no covenant debt at a 6 times multiple, even in an increasing interest rate environment. Better that growth cycle by 5% a year and sell it at an 11 times multiple, those returns are hard to compete with.
Right. For my final question, you do talk to the president one-on-one. We're all wondering, and we promise not to tell anybody, but give us a little, give us a little hint about kind of what's coming up. Any insight into policy decisions or trajectory or anything we should kind of, and again, this is just between us.
Look, here's, and again, it comes just my own personal point of view, that when we talk about policy decisions, it's not one man's decision. The American system is driven by checks and balances, and there's 535 other really competent men and women who have a check and balance on every decision that he makes. So he can lead and he can be harnessed, but he can't dictate. It's impossible for him to dictate. But what I can tell you about the man is I've never seen an individual who is such a warrior. When you think about just what's going on with the media, right, the traditional media, I mean, CNN should send him thank you notes every morning because nobody would watch CNN if it weren't for Donald Trump. On all of our dialogues, whether we like him, whether you don't like him, it's the topic of the day. And he's criticized for everything, every moment of the day. When he goes to his residence at 9 o'clock in the evening, and he is a workaholic, and the tweeting, which drives everybody crazy, is the new mechanism for him to communicate. I can tell you, his mission in his mind is not to make you uncomfortable, is not to unsettle the world, is definitely not to get us into more disputes and wars. It's to provide a strong and reliable balance by providing the drapery of inconsistency. And that concept of providing the drapery of inconsistency is the road in for him to be able to end run his own system. So what you see happening is actually orchestrated, it's thoughtful. The things, the unwrapping of the regulatory environment, which people don't talk about too much, but it's really the key, right? In America, if you can get entrepreneurs to be able to invest their money to create a Cafe Milano, to create a Cafe Milano in Abu Dhabi, to invest their own money, to invest in CapEx, to hire people, to have hope, to have aspiration, that will drift out, and eventually you'll have a different kind of confidence, and that confidence will then grow abroad. So I think what you're going to see is an olive branch to the Palestinians, that this undone peace in our region here, everybody knows has to have a fair balance of what's happening, that the continued alliance, even though the rhetoric is sometimes harsh of the Middle East, will continue, that the trade dialogue with NAFTA will end up having a strong conclusion, and that the military risks of what we see around the world will be held in tow. So I think regardless of what the volatility in the stock market is, regardless of what the Russia investigation is, it's just rhetoric. And the pushback on the system is nothing to be upset about. Look, there's nobody better than Robert Mueller. Right? You can say what you want about the mission of having a special counsel investigate a president, but the individual is first class. Princeton, Vietnam, 12 years in the FBI, qualified, competent. It's there. So that process is not going to be tainted with the rhetoric of should we have a special counsel. So all of the dialogue that's going on, all the dialogue that's going on with the legislature, I mean, are we going to have a shutdown in the government again? Right? This is boys and girls playing badly in the sandbox. That's all that it is, but that's nothing new, and that's not this president. So at the end of the day, I think the dialogue amongst diverse people is a good thing. The inartful language that the president has used to alienate some of the specific groups all over the world has caused a pushback, and that pushback is the thing that's good. The fact that we're talking about it, the fact that people say, I don't like inartful language. Words matter. I want the president to say things that are presidential to calm me emotionally. That the dialogue is a good thing. He's not doing it in a mean way, and I think this is going to be ultimately a good thing for the young leadership around the world. It's happening everywhere. You have a new generation of leadership in this region. You're going to have a new generation of leadership in Latin America. You've seen what happened to Brexit. You've seen what happens to France. People are choosing different options. And if nothing else, we'll move the aircraft carrier of the barnacles that have been so weighty to this entitlement. You know, America, our health system, our public school system, our military system, our social security system is heavy. It's a beautiful country. It needs to be shaken, and that's what this president is about. But I have confidence that there's no black swans as we see it that can impede the road in front of us.
It has been said numerous times by many different people who are in a position to know that Tom Barrack can have any cabinet position or ambassadorship that he wants in this administration. So could I just see by voting by applause, how many people think it would be a good idea if he actually took one of these jobs in the administration? Thank you so much.